this House and this country stands united with the French people in our opposition to all forms of terrorism, and we stand squarely for free speech and democracy. And these people will never be able to take us off those values.
A casual midweek lunch hour in what is called by many the most beautiful and serene city in the world is shattered by bullets flying and bodies in the streets. Terror comes to the doorstep of journalism, and we are forced to re-examine again how we drive the killers from their dens and exact the necessary justice. Let's welcome to MidPoint, Director of Studies at the Institut of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris, British historian, journalist, commentator read in the pages of The Guardian, The Times, and The Mail. John Laughland joins us today. John, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ed.
John, what was the immediate reaction, of course, when you heard, but what are you gauging as the reaction of the Parisians themselves?
Well, I think the reaction is pretty obvious. Everybody is appalled, shocked, angry, and possibly frightened. Because, as we know, as your viewers know, as everybody knows, this is not the first of this kind of attack. It may be the worst terrorist attack in France for 50 years. You have to go back to 1961 to get a terrorist attack of this size in France. But it is certainly not the first attack of its kind. On the contrary, there have been a series of attacks in recent weeks on a much smaller scale, but some of them have been bloody. And of course, there have been very famous terrorist attacks, some of them very murderous, in other European capitals, and in other countries around the world, including Australia, Canada, and of course the United States itself on 9/11. So I think people will, of course, denounce these attacks. You've already broadcast David Cameron and other political leaders doing that. But the fact is that the perpetrators have got away at the time when we're speaking. France is a very heavily policed country, but they ran away. They're not being caught. And everybody knows that there are millions and millions of other Muslims in France and in all other European countries, and indeed in Western countries all around the world, in all the democratic countries around the world. And I'm sure people will be asking themselves, how many more radicals are there left among the very many millions of Muslims who otherwise seem to be peaceable citizens within our midst?
John, you mentioned the word shock in here, but you also talked about the fact that this is not the first time there have been bloody attacks, not only in France, but in other countries in Europe, here in America as well. Honestly, though, John, isn't it fair to say that there shouldn't be shock, because we have seen a consistent escalation of this sort of violence in countries around the world? So why would anyone be shocked that these butchers would take it to this level?
Well, I mean, it's because it's a natural human reaction to be shocked. But of course, you're right. In fact, I've just done an interview on another channel, and I reminded the viewers there that Salman Rushdie, the British author, British Indian author, who published a book that was considered blasphemous to Islam back in the 1980s, received death threats. He's still alive, but only thanks to police protection that has been going on for 3 decades now. And yes, of course, you're right. There is a pattern emerging. And, you know, however many denunciations there may be, and there will be many, the fact is, and it's a horrible thing to say, but those cartoonists who drew blasphemous pictures of the Prophet Muhammad are now dead. And in a sense, actions speak louder than words. However many denunciations there be, however many denunciations there may be, it is inevitable now that journalists and caricaturists, satirists and others will think about what happened to the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists when they want to speak freely in future. It's obvious, in other words, that the margin of free speech is going to close down under this pressure. There's no getting around that fact.
John, the people of Paris are usually those who are easygoing in many ways. They are seen as quiet, understanding, many ways politically correct with the rest of the world. 30 seconds before we take a break. Are you then already sensing the not only anger, but the want of revenge for what happened today?
No, I don't think one can go that far, although I would say that the situation is very, very febrile in France, as it is in many other European countries. Only this morning, a book was published by a very famous novelist, which has attracted a lot of attention, which predicts the arrival to power through democratic means of a Muslim party in France in 2026. And lots of people were denouncing this book. All the politically correct media were denouncing this book as scaremongering this morning. Those denunciations have lasted a few hours, and now I'm sure many people will be going into the bookshops to buy this book to think that it is a prophetic book and not some kind of scaremongering.
Hold that very thought, John. Break, and we return with what is happening in those major cities around the world, the growing Muslim factions that are mostly peaceful, but the dark secret that every nation and government must now come to grips with. It's on MidPoint. Welcome back to MidPoint. The Director of Studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris, France, John Laughland, joins us. John, before we took the break, you mentioned the book that was published today. The book is a novel by Michel Houellebecq, and it imagines the election by the French in 2022 of an Islamic regime headed by a Muslim president. Already in the news today, there have been some people who have come out and said that this author is nothing more than an agitator who manipulates other people's fears and feeds a new civilized racism. Is it not fair to say now that in light of what has happened today, the politically correct, as you have called them, they've ignored this far too long? This is going to be shoved in their face, and people are going to tell these peace-seers, it's time for you to live in the real world and understand that there are killers out there in the midst of people in every community that would be very happy to see more blood spilled on their streets around the world.
Ed, Charlie Hebdo itself ridiculed this book in its front page edition, the one that's currently on the newsstands. The magazine where journalists were murdered in cold blood today itself is a politically correct magazine, which itself particularly attacked this book and made fun of the author, saying that he was a scaremonger and an idiot. You know, you couldn't wish for a more terrible, bloody symbol of the inadequacy of this politically correct ideology. In Germany, there have for several weeks now been demonstrations, spontaneous demonstrations in Dresden against the Islamization of the West. And those demonstrations have been routinely denounced by the entire political and media establishment of Germany as being scaremongering. You're absolutely right in your question. You know, this is the end now of this kind of talk. The problem is, and I say this to an American audience, is that the rhetoric against terrorism, which of course needs to be not only strong but also backed up by actions, has unfortunately been exploited, particularly under the previous president, George Bush Jr., but also to some extent under Obama, to wage interstate wars which have absolutely nothing or very little to do with the problem of radical Islam at home. In a sense, they have made the situation worse. When Britain and America were engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan, Gordon Brown, the British Prime Minister, used to justify those engagements by saying that they were needed to prevent terrorist attacks in Britain. Well, we've seen that that policy is failing. It could never work, and it has obviously failed. So there needs to be a revision of policy, both on the politically correct side and also on the hawkish neocon side in Britain and America.
John, a couple of minutes that we have left here, though. Let's look at the other side of this, the fear factor now, because 10% of the Parisian population is Muslim. And I would imagine right now that there are people who are looking to rise up against that population. We have to say this flat out. There's a lot of people who live there who likely are very peaceful, do not believe in the killing of infidels, if you will. But are we not looking at the possibility of a flashpoint here where there is going to be such a drastic snapback, if you will, against anybody who practices Islam, that we could be looking at a very bloody time, not only in Paris, but in other countries around the world who fear this Islamization and take out the innocents instead of the guilty?
That's not my fear right now. I don't think that there is that kind of sentiment against Muslims generally. It may come. I don't rule it out. It may be possible, and I think it could happen anywhere in Europe, or anywhere in the democratic West for that matter. I don't think it's a particular danger now. But of course people will be frightened. Of course they will be worried. And of course they will be asking themselves questions. You know, they will be asking the questions that we've been asking just now in our debate. They will be understanding above all that political correctness is finished and that the actual presence, as you indicate in your question, of these millions of Muslims, not just in Paris, but all over Europe, the actual physical presence of these people itself represents a severe challenge, even if, of course, as we know, these people are, in the vast majority, peaceful citizens. The fact is that they're a reservoir in which a small minority of dangerous fish can swim.
I've got about 30 seconds left. Have we not reached the point right now where, as I've said this many times, the peaceful Muslims of the world need to rise up? They need to let their voices be heard. They need to be the ones who are out there on the front line, not just everybody else demonstrating, but they need to be fighting against those people of their own religion who create the aura, if you will, of nothing but wanton killers.
Well, to be fair, they have been, actually. You know, Muslim leaders have been among the first here in Paris to denounce this attack. One of them has even visited the site of the attack. They have tried. My fear is that they can't contain this. My fear is that the message of violence is contained in Islam, and that, of course, the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful and all the rest of it. That we know. But I think it's more difficult to argue, as is often claimed, that Islam is quite simply a religion of peace. I personally don't buy that. I think that these attempts by Muslim leaders to contain this issue are likely to prove futile.
We're going to have to stop it right there, but John, you've opened up another discussion for another day. John Laughland, thank you so much for your time and your comments from Paris, and MidPoint will continue covering this developing story.